One of the practices that we're going to work with today, that we're going to do together as well as on our own, is we're going to just look at co regulation and what that means. Emotional regulation is our nervous system coming back into that state of calm, and how we do that with each other is what we're going to work with today. So, we're inspired by Deb Dana's work. Her full interview is free to watch on radicalrecoverysummit.com today until 9 tonight, as well as the other ones. And we could maybe send that interview out as well. I think we might have included it in the resources last week too. And if you don't get the resources and you would like to, which is the audio of the whole meeting and the video that goes onto YouTube of this slides part, and it also includes the practices. If you don't get that, email me and let me know, and we're happy to put you on that list. All right. So, Deb Dana, the science of feeling safe enough to fall in love with life and take the risks of living. So, we can do that when we have a regulated nervous system, and we can't do that when we're in fight, flight, and freeze. So, just as a reminder, or maybe it might be some people might be new to this as well. When we're looking at the Polyvagal Theory, it's a theory that developed by Dr. Stephen Porges. And Deb Dana works very closely with him and really works with implementing that theory. And it's a theory of how the vagus nerve that wanders through our whole body and how the nervous system works. So, ventral vagal is when we're at the top of the ladder, so to speak. It's the most recent part of our nervous system in terms of development over, millennia. And that's when we feel really connected and safe. We feel like it's okay for us to be here. We feel at home. We feel comfortable sharing who we are. We feel connected with ourselves and with other people. And when we don't feel connected, that's a trauma response, is that deep disconnection from ourselves and from each other. So the sympathetic arousal is, and these we go up and down all of the time with these. So the goal isn't to always stay in ventral vagal, because we'd be kind of clenching there. But the goal is to recognize when we're out of ventral vagal and then move into something to bring ourselves back. So sympathetic arousal is fight or flight. And then dorsal vagal is that state of kind of in freeze or collapse. So as a little refresher there. So one thing that we know now through Deb's work, Stephen Porges, many, many other people, as we're working with trauma, Gabor Mate has been a real instrumental person on this for me as well, and for many of us, is that we're wired for connection. So in our nervous system, because partly human babies and children need many, many years of protection before they're able to survive on their own, we have this nervous system that wires us to do that. And so when we're in utero, if the mother isn't too traumatized, then we have that feeling of safety. When the mother is experiencing a lot of activation, then there's a lot of cortisol and adrenaline and those kinds of hormones in utero. But ideally, or even not ideally, but just kind of if we have a good enough experience in utero, then we have that feeling of safety. We're one, we have the heartbeat in there, all of that. And then as we move into birth and then into infancy and childhood, we really need a co regulating adult, at least one. And we need to feel like we're safe and like we're included in a family unit, that we will be protected, that we'll be fed and housed and clothed, and that we'll be protected from danger. And of course, we know that that doesn't always happen, or it happens in a minimal way or not an optimal way. So what happens then, of course, is that we start to turn to other things for a feeling of safety. We start to turn against ourselves, but we always want and long for that connection. So we need to work with it with ourselves. That's something that we work with all the time, connecting with our body, our breath. We connect with ourselves. And that is a really deep healing of trauma that caused us to disconnect. So that connecting with ourselves is a real foundation here. And we also need to feel safe enough, as Stephen Porges says, to feel safe enough in the arms of others. So that would mean, metaphorically sometimes, in an intimate partner relationship, or in a relationship where we feel safe enough to be who we are and we can express ourselves. We're not hiding ourselves. And when we do, when we're hiding or when we're not really sure how it's going to be received, we are really anxious. And that's when we get into some of those fight, flight, or freeze. So, this reciprocal nature of relationships is something that's important. And it's something that happens as a baby. They've done some recent studies now. And if anyone else is kind of a science geek, you could listen to Andrew Huberman, the Huberman Lab podcast. He had a really recent one on connection and some of the studies that show the oxytocin in the brains of mothers and babies as babies are being fed, and that it's a two-way connection, that it's really healthy and helpful for the mother as well as for the baby. And so there's a lot of science now that backs this up, but in fact we could just go into our own kind of hearts and go, yeah, this really makes sense. So this part of it is our nervous system, part of it is our primitive brain saying you need to be in a family unit or some kind of a protected unit in order to survive to adulthood. And then as adults, we know that having some kind of connection in our heart is what makes life feel really, really worthwhile. So the biology of this is that we have this face heart connection. And this is part of the vagal pathway, the vagus nerve, from the heart to the nerves that control our ears, eyes, voice, and head movement. And the reason that I identified those four is that those are the four that Deb talks about as being the social engagement system involves the eyes, ears, voice, and head movement. So we're going to work with all four of those. The head movement is kind of we're kind of looking around. We're kind of looking for friendly faces. We're listening for sounds. There's a visual component of that. So let's do this little experiment. She says, so put your hands on the base of your skull where your brain stem meets your spinal cord. What we're doing here is we're kind of tuning into part of this system, this face heart connection system. So this is the brain stem meets your spinal cord. And now place one hand on the side of your face and the other hand over your heart. And you could have your eyes closed or just your gaze soft. And then we're just feeling into this. Imagine the energy moving between your hands from your face through to your heart and from your heart back to your face. Relax your shoulders, notice your breath, and just notice this feeling. Is there a sense of connection between the two hands? And it might be pretty subtle, or maybe you're not feeling something, that's fine too. So, what we're doing when we're looking, and you can bring your hand down if you want. What we're looking is the sounds of welcome, the looks on people's face, and this really works with our neuroception, which we've talked about quite a bit, the unconscious perception of safety and threat. So we're signaling invitations for connections, or we're sending a warning to stay away. So let's start looking at the eyes, and in a few minutes, we're going to actually go into the small groups and practice these three ways of looking. So if we look at the upper third of the face around the eyes, there's this whole set of little muscles that we don't control. We can do a fake smile, but not necessarily have that same kind of activation in that part of the face. What we're going to work with is this stare. So just kind of a stare with a bit of a glare, very focused. And that's one of the gazes we're going to look at. And then shifting to a neutral gaze where you're really not sending much info. And this can be actually a little bit disconcerting to people because they're not really sure how to read us. Just right now, let's practice this part. So if you were to send a soft, warm look. So in order to really do this, we have to come into feeling soft and warm and connected. So you might look around at the other people on the Zoom if you have your visual. You might look at one person in particular or the whole group or maybe a few people in the group. But as you feel, kind of cultivate that feeling of connection, or maybe you don't have that connection here, but you have it with another person. You could bring them to mind. And let's take a moment just to look into the camera and send a soft, warm look. So that's interesting to look at because it depends on how we're genuinely feeling and what is actually going on in our nervous system. So it's something that we all feel at times, and it's not really something that we can produce on command necessarily. So it's an interesting thing to work with, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about that before we go into the groups. So we assess this as part of our neuroception of safety. So we move towards or away from, depending on what we're seeing on someone's face, and how we interpret what we see is based on our own past experience. So if you have past experience, for instance, with someone who was abusive, who would glare at you in a certain way, and then you see something similar on someone else's face, you're going to have a similar response to that as you did if it was the actual person. So I remember one time working for someone who deliberately, I think, tried to make everyone uneasy, and it was a power over thing. So he was gruff, and he would kind of look at you like you were doing something wrong. And this was a person I was doing bookkeeping for, and I would only be out there once every couple months, and I was always kind of dreading it when I went. And my conscious brain wasn't really online very well, and I would make mistakes, and I would just feel a little bit anxious. And it was his mannerisms. And I saw him do that with other people, and then he'd stop when he was a psychologist. He'd stop when he was with a client, and then he'd do it again with other people. And so I think for him, it was quite deliberate. But I could really notice, I don't know much about the nervous system back then, but I could really notice the effect that it had on me and how anxious it made me. So we really have these cues from people. We might not necessarily know that that's what's happening, but we certainly feel it. So let's just take a little moment now to look around the room. We do this a lot. Look around the room, take a couple of deep breaths, and look to see if there's anything dangerous in the room. Is there anything here that could hurt you physically or socially, emotionally? Just to have a look around. Notice that. And then a few deep breaths. And so, sound is also another way that we assess safety. So, when we feel safe, we listen for sounds of friendship. And when we feel uneasy, we listen for sounds of danger or the presence of predators. So, this makes sense that when we're feeling safe, we're going to attune to that. But also, the negativity bias of the brain will always bring in cues of, oh, there's something here that's not right. And so as we're working with that, we could really just kind of notice, well, what exactly do I feel as I hear certain kinds of sounds? So this is kind of a mindfulness practice to take into your regular life. So as you're listening right now, though, listen and just hear, what are the sounds that you're hearing right now? And notice the different layers of sound. So I can hear the wind. I can hear some crows. What can you hear, and what are the different layers? And some of the work that Peter Levine has done, he talks about low growling sounds as being of a concern to us. like a low growl of a tiger or something would have been. But it underscores again the evolutionary part of this, how our nervous systems developed to keep our bodies safe. And it's not necessarily all that conducive now. And when Bessel van der Kolk was setting up a new place, he was working with the structural engineers to make sure that there was no low growling sounds of air conditioning and heating and those kinds of low engine sounds, because it helps people to feel safer, especially with PTSD, if they don't have those sounds around. So as you move through the week, it'd be interesting just to take some pauses and notice what are the kind of obvious sounds, what are the other sounds, and then also to put yourself into soundscapes that are regulating. So Deb talks about walking by the ocean and the sound of the waves. And that might be something for you. It might be something like being in a forest or listening to music. What are the sounds that help to anchor you in regulation? Just as we're looking at that, take a moment now to have some come to mind. What are some that immediately come to mind? Maybe the sound of someone's voice, or what would it be? So, as we're working with healing our nervous system, this could be an important thing to know. So, if I know that there are certain soundscapes that help me to regulate, then those are ones that I might do before I go into a difficult situation. I might try to have more of that in my regular life. If we are doing some cooking or something and we want to listen to music while we're doing it, or just to know what it is that regulates us and what dysregulates us, can be very helpful in terms of we can use that then as a strategy or as a way to support our nervous system and to avoid some of the sounds that dysregulate our nervous system. And I had experience several years ago of being in a restaurant and realizing how hard that was on my nervous system, the sounds, the noise. It got to a point where it was very difficult for me to be in a restaurant with a lot of other people's noises, and started wearing earplugs. And now, of course, with the better technology, the little noise canceling ones are little instead of over your ears. But these kinds of things are really helpful to look at in terms of assessing your own safety. And one thing that I thought was really important to know as well is that when we're feeling a sense of I'm not safe, we can't really hear the words that are being spoken. So our nervous system, first of all, takes in the prosody, it's called, the kind of musical, the tones, the modulation of a voice. And as we assess our safety, if we feel safe with that person's voice, then we can hear the words. And if we don't feel safe, then we can't hear the words. So that's something else as well when we're looking at, we talk about emotional flooding and being able to be really present and well regulated in our body, and sound is a component of that. So this I'd like to kind of just go over a little bit, and then we'll go into the small groups. So as we're assessing safety, if we have a feeling like we're safe in this environment, we're going to have a curiosity or an ambivalence. It'll be a yes, maybe, or no. But but in this small group, what we're going to practice is those different gazes. So I'm going to try and have the groups of maybe three or four, and we'll have about, well, probably about 15 minutes, maybe 13 or something like that would be helpful, so that everybody has a chance to try the different ones. And then the people who are not doing that, so if everyone has their cameras on, so the people who are not actually doing the look will be just sitting and being in your body and noticing, what do you feel? Does it feel like, what do you feel like when the glare happens, or the neutral? The warm gaze, when it's your turn to do the warm gaze, either tap into a genuine feeling of warmth for someone else who's in the small group. But if that's not there, just to not judge yourself for that, but to bring forward someone else in your mind, or some feeling. It might be a pet or a person. of I feel safe and connected. And if I was looking at that person, this is what would be on my face. And then to just talk about that. Okay, this is what I felt, or this is what I didn't feel, so that everybody has a chance to try both sides of that. And noticing, are you feeling into, like, are you drawn into a connection? Are you not sure? And notice also if something about the person, and this happens all the time to us, something about the person triggers us and we feel it's just reminiscent of somebody else. It might be the tone of their voice, it might be the image of them, or something about their face. So we'll do this as kind of a mindfulness practice, and feel free to have some silence in the groups as well. So the three gazes are a glare, a neutral, and a warm.